Okay, well, good day to all who are joining us. My name is Patience Brown, and I'm from the OECD Secretariat. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to a webinar that introduces a newly published document from OECD, the SAR Assessment Framework. We'll have three presentations today. The first is from me, which is a very high-level introduction to this document. And then I'll be joined by two colleagues, Dr. Chermanskaya and Dr. Gysi, to give a much more detailed and content-rich discussion about the contents of this document. We'll be recording today's presentation, so you can revisit these at any time and hopefully share with your interested colleagues. And I'd like to point out that we will have these presentations and then have quite a bit of time afterward for a panel discussion. So please include your questions in the Q&A, and not the chat, but the Q&A, and they'll be answered afterward. In addition, feel free to upvote any questions that you're interested in seeing answered, and we'll prioritize that in case we're short on time. We may have so many questions that we answer those in writing after the presentations, but we'll just see how that goes. In addition, I would like to point out that this is really a group effort, and I'm very thankful to all of the participants who aren't reflected here, but were part of the OECD expert group to make this document finalized. So without further delay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the SAR toolbox to provide a little bit of context about the OECD work in this space, and then talk specifically about the SAR Assessment Framework. I should probably add a little bit of detail of myself. Apologies. As I mentioned, my name is Patience Brown, and I'm the Principal Administrator for the OECD Working Party on Hazard Assessment. And the Working Party on Hazard Assessment is the group that oversees the SAR Toolbox work and the SAR Assessment Framework we'll talk about today. So the OECD has been working in the SAR space for quite a while. In fact, the work in this area was initiated in the early 2000s, and the goal was to develop a computational tool that would support placing substances into chemical categories to predict apical outcomes of regulatory interest. In addition, the SAR toolbox was foreseen as a way to use data from tested category members or analogs to aid in filling gaps for untested category members, or in other words, supporting a read-across approach. Well, certainly the toolbox does that, but now it does a lot more than that as well. So there are about 60 databases that contain experimental data for over 100,000 chemicals and over 3 million data points that can be used to support read-across predictions. In addition, there are a variety of profilers for properties of chemicals, and these profilers include not only structural profilers that support identification of similar substances, but also mechanistic profilers that improve the understanding of the mode of action and can be used to support the activity of substances or form mechanistic groups. Oops. In addition to these, there are a number of not only databases on experimental data on metabolites, but also metabolism simulators that can be taken into account when assessing the activity of a single substance or of categories as well. So OECD really sees the SAR toolbox as a tool to support alternatives to animal testing. So the toolbox can be used to inform testing strategies by forming categories that I just mentioned and helping to identify data gaps, and to assist in developing intelligent testing strategies. And these are intended, of course, to reduce not only the cost associated with testing, but the numbers of animals that are required. In addition, the SAR toolbox can be used to predict properties. So these predictions can actually, in some cases, replace the need for information requirements or test data, and can be used to support prioritization and substance evaluation. And then lastly, of course, the SAR toolbox can be used in sustainable development and green chemistry. The idea is that one can use the toolbox to predict potential toxicity even before the substances are produced, and there's a substantial financial investment behind these. All of this is to say that the SAR toolbox is foreseen as a tool to be used by both the regulated community or industry and by regulators as well. So as I mentioned, the SAR toolbox is part of many tools that we have at OECD that we consider new approach methods. Certainly, the list here on the number of global drivers to use new approach methods in chemical risk assessment is not exhaustive, and there's a lot of emphasis that's placed on the reduction in animal use. Of course, this is a huge and important purpose behind using such methods, but it's not the only one. And I think it's important to emphasize that in many cases, these approaches use the best available science. They reduce the time necessary to make a decision on chemical safety. They increase the throughput of chemicals for that somewhere around 70% of chemicals that don't have sufficient data sets to do a complete risk assessment. And in some cases, in fact, the approaches that are new approach methods may be more relevant to the target species. We talk a lot about the human relevance, but of course, this is true for ecotoxicology as well. So to be able to use such methods in a regulatory context, we must be sure that they're scientifically sound and robust. So that's really where the SAR Assessment Framework comes in. The project was added to the OECD Hazard Assessment Work Program in early 2021, but in fact, this was in response to a need that was identified several years beforehand. And unfortunately, it wasn't until 2021 that we had a lead for such project. It was initially proposed by the Institute of Health for Italy, ISS, as the initial leads, and then joined by the European Chemicals Agency as a co-lead. And this was an extraordinary amount of work that they put into making this document. It's certainly, as I mentioned, worth mentioning the extraordinary effort from the SAR Assessment Expert Group that was a group of experts nominated by OECD delegations. And this group met through a series of teleconferences that took place in 2021, 2022, and the first part of 2023. The group not only contributed to the drafting of the subsections of the document, but also in the review of the document. And to help finalize the draft, there was a face-to-face meeting at the end of 2022. Immediately following the first final draft, the document was submitted for written comments to the Working Party on Hazard Assessment and then declassified at the end of, Q3 of 2023, so just about a month and a half ago. All of this is to describe that this was a very robust review. It involved experts in the areas of SARs, toxicology, and regulatory decision-making. And we hope to have a document that's really well vetted and very useful for its purpose. So not only do we have the traditional sort of OECD document, which isn't necessarily very content rich, but isn't necessarily very attractive, but we also made a glossy version of this. It's a PDF version that's very nice, very readable. And for those of you interested, it's available through the traditional OECD websites, but also there's a QR code for those who like to access information that way. So what's in the document? So high-level overview, starting with the objectives, were to develop a systematic and harmonized framework for the regulatory assessment of SARs and their resulting predictions. So the scope, as I already mentioned, is SAR models, but for the first time also extended a lot of this analysis to the predictions and results based on multiple predictions, and you'll hear more about that in just a second. In terms of the relevance of the document and the applicability, this was intended to be a flexible and inclusive document. So it's really relevant irrespective of the technique used to build the model, the predictive endpoint, and the intended regulatory purpose. In terms of audience, it's primarily aimed at regulatory authorities, but it's also a valuable reference for other stakeholders that are using SARs in a regulatory context. So the overview here is really a development of guidance and a series of criteria that are based on two previously existing OECD guidance documents. These are guidance document 49, which describe the principles for validation of SARs, and guidance document 69, which is the guidance for validation of structure activity relationship models. So one is simply the principles, and the second is guidance on how to evaluate such principles. I should note that both of these documents are based on OECD Guidance Document 34, which are the principles for validating internationally harmonized test methods. So these are really the robust standards that OECD uses to vet any method used in a regulatory context. One of the first activities that was undertaken of this project was to review the principles that were in those documents written almost 2 decades ago now, and to evaluate if they were still relevant. And in fact, the expert group determined that they were still relevant. However, this document really expands on those principles quite a bit. So there are sections on the principles for assessing models. As mentioned, there's some information on that in those previously existing documents, but also extends these principles for assessing predictions and the principles from results from multiple predictions. So this is an extension beyond anything that we had previously for guidance. For each of these, the group developed a set of assessment elements and a checklist of criteria. So the document includes guidance on how to determine if the criteria are met, and also includes examples illustrating how to evaluate each criterion. So for those of you who are interested in learning more, I'll point you to the OECD QSAR Toolbox webpage. Right now you see the advertisement for the webinar you're listening to, but after this presentation, there'll be links to not only the QSAR Assessment Framework, which there already are, but also to these presentations. And coming soon, there'll also be a list of detailed examples of how to apply this guidance in real-world settings. And then lastly, I'd like to point out that at the very bottom of what you can see here, there are links to QSAR tutorials that were developed by ECHA and available on their YouTube channel for those of you who are just starting in the QSAR space and would like some information on how to use these tools. So I'll thank you all very much for listening, and it's my pleasure to be introducing my colleagues who will give you a much more detailed description on some of the content of the document I just described. As I mentioned at the beginning of today's presentation, we encourage you to include your questions in the Q&A and to upvote any questions you've seen, and there'll be a rich panel discussion after the presentations. So pausing, I am very pleased to introduce my colleague Olga Cheremenskaya, who's a senior researcher at the Italian Institute of Health. Her expertise includes alternative animal-free methods of risk assessment, such as QSAR models, integrated approaches to testing and assessment, or IATAs, adverse outcome pathways, as well as data management and database development. Olga holds a PhD in chemistry of biologically active substances and a master's degree in biochemistry, and as I mentioned, was a co-lead in this project. So it's my pleasure to give the floor to Olga.
Thank you, Patience. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation. Thank you so much for joining, and I would like to thank the OECD for organizing this webinar. It's my great pleasure to be here today. So my presentation will take about 25 minutes, and the subject of this talk will be the first part of the QSAR Assessment Framework, which covered the assessment of QSAR models. Some specific examples will be given to illustrate the assessment criteria of the QSAR Assessment Framework. So let me begin from explaining the main structure of the QSAR Assessment Framework guidance published by OECD just a couple of months ago. On the left side, you see the first page of the final version of the document, while on the right side, you see the table of context and the part that will be covered by my presentation. So this slide gives a short overview of the existing OECD QSAR model validation principles that have been used as a starting point in our project. The set of 5 principles was established and published by OECD in 2004, and then a guidance document for a transparent application of those principles was developed and published by OECD in 2007. The OECD QSAR models principles have been extensively used by scientific and regulatory communities for almost 20 years, and these principles include defined endpoint, unambiguous algorithm, defined domain of applicability, appropriate measure of goodness of fit, robustness and predictivity, and mechanistic interpretation if possible. So at the beginning of the CAF project, the OECD principles and the related guidance from 2007, they were re-examined in order to identify possible needs for modification or update. Rather than the development of extensive textual guidance, the expert group recommended a more practical and workable document that should be flexible enough and regulatory framework independent. This process led to the development of new checklist and related short guidance for model evaluation. They're both based on the well-established OECD principles that were considered still relevant for the purpose of QAF. The innovative aspect of this project is that as a result of the work of the CAF expert group over the past 2 years, each of the principles has been divided into assessment elements. So the guidance gives more details for each assessment element, while the checklist gives more practical advice and examples. Each assessment element can be evaluated and reported in the checklist. So let me give you some background information on the definition of some terms within CAF relevant for model assessment. Model checklist is a separate document aiming to facilitate the assessment of QSAR models according to the CAF principles. It includes a list of assessment elements, and each assessment element is a critical aspect to be considered when assessing QSAR models, prediction, and overall results. So QSAR model is a model that predicts the property of a substance using as input the information on its structure. And property here is any property of a substance. And in this document, we use the term property instead of the term endpoint because of the different understanding of the meaning of the term endpoint depending on the audience. So the Excel file containing the checklist can be downloaded from the link provided in the Annex C of the CAF. And the assessment element can be evaluated and reported in 3 different checklists. The first checklist is model checklist, then prediction checklist, and result checklist. So that determines the overall acceptability of the QSAR information for use in a regulatory context. The CAF provides a roadmap starting with the criteria assessment element related to the assessment of the QSAR models, and the assessor should assign a value to each assessment element that could be fulfilled, not fulfilled, applicable, not accessed, not documented, and so on. The comment field is also available in the checklist. The analysis of each element supports the overall decision whether the model is suitable or not for the intended regulatory purpose. So the aim of the model checklist is to provide a harmonized and user-friendly evaluation of a model. It should facilitate the practical application of the principle of QSAR model evaluation. And here you see the Excel table, model criteria, and Kumerev mapping that include the following columns: the number of assessment element, name of assessment element, objective, what should be checked and how, practical advice, examples, and also mapping to Kumerev, which is QSAR model reporting format. In the next slides, I would like to expand on each assessment element, emphasizing the aspect related to the practical advice and examples. So the first OECD principle is defined endpoint. The intent of this principle is to ensure transparency in the endpoint predicted by a given model. And here, the only time we are using the term endpoint instead of property, because it's used in the title of the historical established principle. This principle has been subdivided in 3 assessment elements that will be addressed in the next slides. So assessment element 1.1 is clear scientific and regulatory purpose. The objective here is that predicted endpoint should be clearly defined in relation to a scientific and or regulatory purpose. And the predicted endpoint should be clearly defined and consistent with the data used to build the model. For a clear scientific purpose, the predicted endpoint should refer to any property of a substance that can be measured and therefore modeled. For a clear regulatory purpose, the predicted endpoint should be associated to a specific regulatory requirement or test method or test guideline. Practical advice here that the description of the predicted endpoint should be as detailed as possible by including all elements that have been considered. For instance, unit of measurements, time scale, observations such as growth, mortality, and so on. And let me provide one example here. It's if a predicted endpoint is specified as a fish short-term toxicity 96 hours and LC50 according to the OECD test guideline 203. In this case, both the scientific and regulatory purposes are clear, so the assessment element can be considered as fulfilled. Assessment element 1.2, transparency of the underlying experimental data. The objective here is that documentation should be sufficient to independently assess the quality of the experimental data that have been used to build the model. What to check and how? It's necessary that all substances are clear, have the clear identifications, and the reference to the original studies ideally should be provided. Description of all relevant experimental conditions that could affect the prediction, and if in case of data processing before modeling, information data processing procedure should be provided, and also if multiple data for the same substance were aggregated for modeling, also the availability of the description of the data aggregation procedure is also very important, and the information on the experimental data selection and curation procedure. Not always the full detail on each data point are available, of course, but at least a general description of the experimental data selection and curation procedure should always be expected. As an example here, if we have as predicted endpoint bacterial mutagenicity according to OECD testing guideline 471, and the information on the underlying data does not include the information on the strains and on the metabolic activation. In this case, for instance, under REACH regulation, this assessment element could not be fulfilled because the information on the strains is required. So the assessment element 1.3 is the quality of the underlying experimental data. Here it's necessary to check if the experimental data curation procedure is explained, and to assess the quality of the data point individually if possible. So ideally, data points should be evaluated individually. However, it's not always possible for instance, for large training set, and at least all conditions that could affect the results of experimental studies should be considered when selected data to build the model. For model with large training set, it's possible also for a regulator to check some data points. So as an example here, if we have fish long-term toxicity and duration of the exposure was not considered when selected data to build the model. In this case, it's possible to suspect that also the data from fish short-term toxicity studies were included in the training set. So in this case, as the assessment element is not fulfilled and the model cannot be considered valid for predicting fish long-term toxicity. And the second OECD principle is an ambiguous algorithm. The intent of this principle is to ensure transparency in the description of the model algorithm, and so the reproducibility of its prediction. This principle has been split in 3 assessment elements that will be illustrated in more detail in the next slides. So assessment element 2.1, description of the algorithm and or software. Here it's necessary to ensure that it's clear how the prediction is obtained and that it can be reproduced by others. Here is important also to check if sufficient description of all descriptors and approach used for the selection and calculation procedure is provided, and to check the availability of transparent description of the algorithm and or software. And for fragment alert-based model, the list of all fragments and substructure should be provided. And for equation-based model, description of the equation and all data descriptors and approach used for the selection should be provided as well. And next, the description of the algorithm might not be always publicly available, especially for commercial models. In such case, any available relevant information should still be accessed. And if a model is implemented in a computer program and this program is accessible to assessor, the reproducibility of the result can be tested even if the description of the algorithm is not fully disclosed. And in this case, the assessors may decide that is acceptable for some regulatory uses or not acceptable for the regulatory use. As an example here, if a computer program or an algorithm includes all manuals, publication, help file that is explaining the algorithm, in this case, the assessment element can be considered as fulfilled. The assessment element 2.2, inputs and other option. Here is necessary to check availability of the instruction to prepare the input and availability of information on the editable option settings, if there are any. Of course, for some computer programs which are quite simple and without any editable settings, less explanation is required. But for more complex program, allowing editing of the settings of the algorithm, more detailed explanation is required here. As an example, if the instruction, the data preparation and the data input include instruction how to pre-process salts and the target substances is salt, in this case, the assessment element can be considered as fulfilled. Assessment element 2.3, model accessibility. What to check and how? Here, it's necessary to check the availability of the same model or computer program and version described in the documentation. When a different model version is available to assessor, it can be considered to use it and to compare the results. As an example here, in vitro mutagenicity Ames test alert model, fragment-based model, implemented in TOX3 software version 3.1.0, available in the SearchForge website. All information is available, so the assessment element is fulfilled. So the third OECD principle is defined domain of applicability. The guidance from 2007 described the applicability domain as the response and chemical structure space in which the model makes prediction with a given reliability. Elaborating on the applicability domain definition given above, the applicability domain should consider the parametric structure, mechanistic, metabolic, and response space of the model. If the QAF does not prescribe any specific way to define the applicability domain, because multiple valid methodology can be used for this definition, but instead the QAF guidance focuses on practical aspects of the assessment. This principle has just one assessment element that will be explained in the next slide. Assessment element 3.1, clear definition of the applicability domain, the limitation of the model, what to check and how. Here it's necessary to check that applicability domain definition has sufficient details to decide if a substance is within applicability domain or not. Many modern models automatically assess if substance falls within the applicability domain. And in this stage, we are talking about the global definition of applicability domain. A local definition of applicability domain can be also important, but it's considered more under the prediction checklist. As an example here, if the prediction report obtained using a model includes all the information on the applicability domain of the model in relation to the input substance, explaining how the assessment is done, in this case, the assessment element is fulfilled. The next OECD principle is appropriate measure of goodness of fit, robustness, and predictivity. This principle provides information on the goodness of fit and robustness of a model is determined by internal validation, and the predictivity of a model is determined by external validation. It's important to mention here that the model performance should be measured within the applicability domain defined by developers. This principle is divided into two assessment elements that will be addressed from point of view of practical advice and example in more details in the next slide. But as to scientific aspects concerning this principle, the OECD guidance from 2007 can be consulted. Assessment element 4.1, goodness of fit, robustness, and assessment element 4.2, external predictivity. And the objective of these assessment elements is to ensure that measures of internal predictivity as well as of external predictivity are provided and considered adequate. What to check and how? It's important to check here the available information, the statistical methods used for internal validation of the model. So for model predicting continuous endpoints, availability, at least the basic statistic, such a correlation, square coefficient value, and the standard error should be provided. And for model predicting categorical endpoint, availability, at least basic statistics such as accuracy, sensitivity, and specificity also should be provided here. The information should be provided. And if the regulatory context sets some specific reference value, necessary to compare the performance of the model to the reference value. And it's important to mention here that the CAF guidance does not include any reference value, any threshold, but the assessment should be always regulatory framework specific. And the indication where the cross-validation or resampling was performed is also very important. So we are talking here about the general performance of the model. For accessing individual results, local performance also can be very important, but it will be explained under the prediction checklist. If a model documentation does not report any external predictivity evaluation, a regulatory authority is responsible for the assessment should decide if this is acceptable or not for the application. If the external validation has been performed using data selected according to different criteria than in the training set, in this case also the assessment of data quality is very important. As an example here, if for a model predicting categorical endpoint, the information of accuracy, sensitivity, and specificity on the training set, on the external set is provided and considered good enough by regulators, in this case, the assessment element is fulfilled. And the last OECD principle is mechanistic interpretation that should be associated with QSAR model if possible. If relevant, assessors may require that the model documentation includes consideration of the mechanistic interpretation consistent with the knowledge related to the predicted property. For instance, here adverse outcome pathways information or toxicokinetics information can be part of the mechanistic interpretation. This principle has just one assessment element that will be explained in the next slide. Assessment element 5.1, plausibility of the mechanistic interpretation. What to check and how? It's important to check here the scientific plausibility of the proposed mechanistic interpretation. For example, also the references to scientific literature could be very important. If selection and interpretation of the descriptors has been explained and consistent with a known mechanism of action. And also it's important to provide an information at what stage of modeling the mechanistic basis of the model was identified a priori or posteriori for modeling, but in both cases the providing of mechanistic interpretation is very important. And also interpretation of the molecular events that can be activated by molecules containing certain substructures that connect as stressors in different pathways activation. However, even if mechanistic interpretation is really very important and can greatly facilitate regulatory acceptance of the model, it's still considered as optional, and also it has been suggested by the OECD guidance document from 2007. Here is an example. If the documentation of the model which predict skin sensitization based on structure alerts include an explanation on how the structure alerts are supposed to bind the proteins causing skin sensitization, in this case assessment element is fulfilled. It's well known that the protein binding is the first step of the molecular initiating event of the skin sensitization adverse outcome pathway. So this is the basis of the mechanistic interpretation here. Then on this slide, I would like to show you what is the place of the model checklist in the global SAR Assessment Framework workflow. The CAF provides a roadmap starting with the assessment of SAR models and then extending to the requirements specific for the evaluation of prediction and results. You see here highlighted the part of QAF workflow covered by me today, while the next part will be illustrated in the next presentation. It's important to mention that in the case of the result based on multiple prediction, the compilation of the model checklist is required for each model. The compilation of the model checklist is the first step in QSAR in the CAF assessment, and when a model is considered not as acceptable, then the assessment could just be concluded here without further considering prediction and results. So in my last slide, I would like to conclude and to sum up the main application of the model checklist. Our expectation is that the application of the checklist can help to improve transparency of the model's evaluation by regulators. When accessing a large data set, assessment of individual prediction may not be feasible. So in such cases, the assessor may need to rely exclusively on the use of the model checklist as a standalone tool. When assessing the prediction obtained by using the same QSAR model for the same regulatory purpose, there is no need to repeat the model assessment each time. However, if the regulatory purpose is different, the assessment should be repeated. So it's important to always keep this in mind, that the assessment of a model is regulatory purpose specific. And for model assessors, the model checklist can greatly facilitate the identification of all important information available in a model documentation. And from another hand, the checklist could also be useful to the model developers, indicating the best practices in model documentation preparation. A mapping between the model checklist and QMRF reporting format can serve as feedback to model developers for further improvement of their models and related documentation. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Concluding, I would like to thank my colleagues Cecilia Boss and Chiara Laura Battistelli for being the co-coordinators of this project, the OECD Secretariat, Patience Brownie, and Tomoko Aoyashi for their so great constant support for this project, and the whole CAF expert group, and of course the ECHA co-lead Andrea Gisi, who will be the next presenter today. If you have any question, I am happy to answer them. There will be time for Q&A session at the end of Andrea's presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Germanskaya, for a great presentation. I think it was very clear, and I can see a number of very interesting questions coming through the Q&A. Please keep them coming. As Olga mentioned, we will have time after our next presenter to discuss those questions and have a hopefully very rich response from both of our panel members. So thank you very much. And it is my pleasure to welcome our next and final presenter today, Dr. Andrea Gisi, who's been working in the Computational Assessment and Alternatives Method Unit of the European Chemicals Agency since 2013. Dr. Gisi's main responsibilities include the assessment of QSAR studies in REACH registration dossiers, the project management of the OECD QSAR toolbox, and the coordination of ECHA's activities on QSARs. Andrea holds a PhD in pharmaceutical science and a master's degree in medicinal chemistry, and it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Dr. Gisi. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Patience, for the introduction and also for setting up this webinar. So I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully you can see it now. And then let's go to the second part of this webinar that is about the assessment of QSAR predictions and results. There are three parts in this presentation: the assessment of individual predictions, the assessment of results based on multiple predictions, and then I also have a couple of slides on the extension of OECD harmonized templates based on the QSAR assessment framework. I will be therefore covering mainly the second part of the CAF guidance document. This slide explains why we needed a QSAR assessment framework. And this was because the use of QSARs is allowed in many chemical regulations. And the OECD QSAR principles established in 2004 cover the scientific validity of QSAR models. However, as regulators, we are faced with the question on whether a prediction or result is valid and not just the model in general. So, because even the use of a valid model does not guarantee the validity of each result. So what we needed to do was to establish principles to assess individual results. And then we also wanted to establish a systematic and harmonized assessment framework for both QSAR models, as just explained by Olga, and predictions that I will explain now. First of all, we discussed and agreed 4 new OECD principles for evaluating QSAR predictions and results based on multiple predictions. First, the input must be correct. Second, the substance must be within the applicability domain of the model. Third, the prediction has to be reliable. And fourth, the outcome must be fit for purpose. Here, there was like a long discussion about applicability domain and reliability. If you're familiar with QSAR models, you know that the applicability domain also assesses the reliability of the prediction. So why did we separate them here in the principles? Because there is not a universally agreed definition or best way to define applicability domain. So what we decided was that the applicability domain as defined by model developers is okay, and we are going to assess it under the principle number 2. However, there are a number of elements which we believe are important for a prediction to be considered reliable that we are going to assess under principle 3. Now, when the applicability domain already considers some of the elements under reliability, we don't have to repeat the assessment. But principle 3 ensures that even when the applicability domain is defined in a less strict way, we still have like a place to check some elements which we believe are important. And we will see more details in the next slides. Also, for results based on multiple predictions, what the QAF recommends is to assess individually each prediction and then consider an additional evaluation step to see dedicated to the final result. In the guidance document, we can see that for each principle, we have the assessment elements, just as we have for assessment elements for models. And we have 1, 2, 3 paragraphs maximum for each of the assessment elements that are then further explained also in the checklist. And we also explain the conditions for fulfilling the assessment elements in the guidance and the checklist. Here on the left, we see, for example, a screenshot to explain principle 1, a correct input in the guidance document. But perhaps even more importantly, what we did with the QAF is to provide these checklists. This is the checklist for assessing individual QSAR prediction. Just like for models, we see the principles and we see the assessment elements. But here in this case, we have some extra elements. We have the weight of each assessment element. We have the outcome that we had also for models, and we have the uncertainty. And then we reserved a column also for comments. So what are we expected, or what do we expect here in the checklist? First of all, the weight of each assessment element indicates how important is the assessment element in the context of use of the prediction. It depends on the purpose of use of the prediction. We suggest some default values for the weight. However, this can be edited by assessors because for certain purposes, certain assessment elements may not be considered that important. And others may be considered more important. So there are 3 possible values: low, medium, and high. The outcome, just like for models, we have fulfilled, not fulfilled, not applicable, assessed, or not documented. And then we have the uncertainty. Uncertainty is intended in the QAF on how confident is the assessor with the outcome, on whether an assessment element is fulfilled or not, and can be low, medium, or high, where by default, high uncertainty is assigned to assessment elements that are not fulfilled or not documented. While for assessment elements that are fulfilled, then the assessor can indicate also low or medium uncertainty. Why did we introduce the uncertainty? Because we know that in real cases, very often it's going to be difficult to make a call on whether an assessment element is assessed, especially if we have only 2 options, yes or no, because very often we might be somehow somewhere in the middle. And introducing the uncertainty, we give the possibility to assessors to consider as fulfilled some assessment elements, even when they are not perfect, and then to indicate eventually a slightly higher uncertainty to document that still certain aspects of the assessment elements may have not been fully fulfilled. Once there is an outcome and uncertainty for each assessment element, then there is the conclusion on the individual prediction, where we have the overall uncertainty of the prediction, which is based on the highest uncertainty of a high weight assessment element. And then we have the outcome of the assessment, which could be acceptable, not acceptable, or documentation insufficient. But what is very important is that the outcome is specific for the intended purpose, meaning that the same prediction might be acceptable for a given purpose and not acceptable for a different purpose. What we suggest in the QAF is to accept predictions with low or medium uncertainty, and therefore do not accept predictions with high uncertainty. But evaluators, depending on the framework, may also do otherwise. One very important part of the documents we published is, if you want, a little bit hidden compared to the main guidance, but very, very important, is the spreadsheet called the Prediction Criteria and Uncertainty. We have two of them in the checklist, one for the prediction and the other one for the result. So when you open the QAF checklist, normally you end up on the first page, the model checklist, but don't forget to check the spreadsheet on criteria and uncertainty, because there, for every assessment element, you have further explanation of what it means, practical advice on how to perform the assessment, you have examples, and in the case of the prediction and result checklist, you even have a dedicated column to the uncertainty to explain low, medium, and high uncertainty for each assessment element with examples for each of them. And we also have the mapping to the QSAR prediction reporting format, so that you even know where to look for this information in the QPRF. So remember to check this part of the spreadsheet too. What I'm going to do in the next few slides is to show you what we have in this spreadsheet for the first principle, a correct input. And there is no time to also show the others, but you can go and consult the document yourself. So for the correct input, we have the three assessment elements: clear and complete description of the input and model settings, input representative of the substance under analysis, and the reliable input parameters. Here we have like the objective of the assessment element is called in the spreadsheet. So for example, for the first, we have that all information, input structure and or parameters model cell settings is available to the assessors, making the prediction reproducible. Then for the assessment element 1.2, we have that the structures modeled have to represent the substance subject to the regulatory assessment. And this is not trivial if substances are defined like in REACH, where one substance may have a very complex composition, may have multiple constituents, impurities, additives. In some cases, the composition may also be not fully known, or can be variable, or can be on biological origin. So this assessment element for real life substances is not trivial at all. And we also want to see that when models accept other input parameters, also these other input parameters are reliable. So when you go further in the checklist, then you have this column called what to check and how. And here for the assessment element 1.1, we have those details. It is clear whether the structure is input by using smiles or other identifiers. If other parameters are also used as input, they are described. If relevant, conformational three-dimensional information is also given. And in case of editable options, check if default settings are applied, and if not, a justification is provided. Then we give the example of a model that requires smiles and optionally low KOW as input to generate a prediction. And we suggest that the assessment element is fulfilled with low uncertainty if both smiles and low KOW are provided, is fulfilled with medium uncertainty if the smiles is provided and log KOW is not provided. And there is high uncertainty only when only cast number is provided, but maybe the cast smiles association is ambiguous. So the regulator in this case has to guess and maybe try different structures and make sure that understands what has been provided to the regulator. And like this, we have a similar explanation for each of the assessment elements in the checklist. I will not go into details for the other assessment elements, but I still listed them. For the second principle, substance within the applicability domain of a valid model, we have that the substance has to meet the applicability domain requirements as defined by the model developers, and also that any other limitation of the model is considered. And why did we need to specify this separately? There are many cases where applicability domains are defined maybe somewhere in the documentation with the mathematical formulas, ranges, and so on. And it is clear that this is the applicability domain. And then in some other part of the documentation, the model developers may write, by the way, this model does not work for salts or doesn't work for substances that ionize, and so on. So we wanted to make sure that not only the part where the applicability domain is formally defined, but also any other limitation is considered when we look at the principle number 2 for the validity of the prediction. Then we go to the third and perhaps most complex principle to assess, which is the reliability of the prediction. We have 6 assessment elements. The prediction must be reproducible. The overall performance of the model has to be good enough. The substance must fit within the physical-chemical structure and response spaces of the training set of the model. We check also that the performance of the model for similar substances is good enough when similar substances with reliable data are available. We check that mechanistic and/or metabolic considerations, if provided, they make sense. And we check that the QSAR prediction is consistent with any other information for the same or other related endpoints available for the substance. As I mentioned before, it can very well be that some of these assessment elements are already considered by model developers in their definition of applicability domain, and therefore they will be covered under principle 2. But if they are not, we have a chance to go back to them when assessing reliability. Finally, we have that the outcome must be fit for the regulatory purpose. So we have 3 assessment elements: the compliance with additional requirements. For example, if a regulation requires the use of 2 different models and what we receive as regulation is only one result, then this will not be met because the regulation requires 2 models. We also want to see a correspondence between the predicted property and the property required by the regulation. Here we have the example under REACH. We have a very, very specific regulatory requirements, and they have to be exactly the endpoints or properties that are covered by the model. For example, a requirement under REACH is the in vitro mutagenicity according to Ames test using 5 strains and considering metabolic activation. If the endpoint predicted by the model is just mutagenicity, then this is not good because we need the equivalent of an Ames test. And then there is also the last assessment element is decidability within the specific framework. This means that with the prediction, you are able to make a regulatory decision. And for example, this can be done if the model provides results that are in the same unit or a convertible unit to the result that you need to make the decision. For example, if we needed to decide if a substance is bioaccumulative or not under REACH for PBT purposes, we use a threshold of 2000 liter per kilogram, a BCF of 2000. And if a model is predicting bioaccumulation based on some other parameters that cannot be converted to BCF, then we will not be able to make a decision with that prediction, and this assessment element will not be fulfilled. So this concludes the overview of the 4 principles for individual predictions, and please just go and check the QAF for more details. Now we have a few slides on the assessment of results based on multiple predictions. And we see results from multiple predictions when different models are used to predict the same structure, and or when predictions from the same models are provided for different structures. For example, if we have a substance with multiple constituents, or if there is a prediction for the substance and its metabolites, then we can see the same model applied to multiple structures. Or in the most complex cases, we may have a combination of the above. So what we do in these cases, 4 steps. First, complete a checklist for each prediction individually in the result checklist. Second, assess the additional assessment element, that is the correct determination of the final result from individual predictions. Then determine the uncertainty of the final result by weighting the uncertainty of individual predictions, where, for example, consistent independent predictions will lead to lower uncertainty. And finally, decide on the acceptability of the result, and the QAF suggests to accept results with low or medium uncertainty, as we have seen also for predictions. This is just a visualization of what I just explained for results from multiple predictions. You have individual predictions with their uncertainty and outcome. They are put together into a QSAR result. And here we can check how the final result is determined, and then conclude on the final results, uncertainty and outcome. Visual abstract, Olga has already shown this. I think what is important here to understand is who does what in this framework. For the model, is the model developer that provides the QMRF, and the assessor compiles the checklist. For the QPRF, we expect the QSAR user to provide the QPRF, and then the assessor checks the checklist. And the same applies to results from multiple predictions, except that we will be facing multiple QMRFs and QPRFs. With the QAF, we also updated the QSAR prediction reporting format, and this was a major update because now this reflects like the QAF. So we have 8 main sections that mirror the QAF structure. While for the QSAR model reporting format, we just did a minor update because the OECD principles for the validity of models have not been changed. Although it was discussed whether to make more significant updates of the QMRF, answer was not for now, because so many models have already been developed with the old QMRF. And unless we have a very strong reason to then ask the developers to go back to their QMRFs and update them, we can probably live with the old version. So this is only a minor update, which doesn't even change the field numbers of the QMRF. So finally, 2 slides on the joint project between EFSA and ECHA on the extension of OECD harmonized templates for structuring and reporting QSAR-based data in Euclid 6. And here I adapted the slides that were prepared by Edoardo Carnesecchi from EFSA. And just really a few words, but if you are not familiar with Euclid, be aware that regulatory agencies store data on chemicals using the Euclid databases. And the Euclid data format follows OECD harmonized templates. And currently, there are not QSAR-specific fields, such as the applicability domain in OECD harmonized templates. So the QPRF relevant information very often can only be included as attachments. So what we are doing with this project is to propose an extension of OHTs to include QSAR-specific fields for our endpoints. And in the end, we proposed around 20 and new fields. and they will be implemented in Euclid as conditional fields. So only if QSARs is selected as study type, then you have a few new fields dedicated to QSARs. We have now reached the end of the OECD consultation for this proposal, and we should see the changes in the next release of Euclid in April 2024. This leads me to the conclusion of my presentation. What is next? We identify the further work opportunities. First, to prepare endpoint-specific case studies to be proposed under the OECD IATA case study project. Remember, with the QAF, we had the mandate to create a framework that was applicable irrespective of the endpoint. And in some cases, you may feel like when we gave examples, maybe we didn't go the way to explain exactly what to do for each endpoint. But there are tens or even maybe hundreds of endpoints that potentially need or could be predicted. So what we suggested is that for the most important, useful endpoints, maybe to have case studies where we can be more precise on what to do specifically for one endpoint. We also identified some needs for reporting, this extension of OHTs I just spoke about, a new report for results from multiple predictions we felt could be needed, and also other maybe update further the QMRF or to prepare a technical annex on external predictivity of QSAR models. Take-home messages from today. The QAF establishes new OECD principles for the assessment of predictions and results from multiple predictions. It provides guidance and checklists for the assessment of models and results. With a systematic and harmonized assessment framework, the QAF benefits regulators first, but we believe also our model developers and users can benefit, because if you know the rules, then it's perhaps easier to develop models that are compliant with these rules, and users can anticipate the regulatory outcome when they prepare a prediction. And also the assessment of QSAR in part of the IATA case studies should be facilitated by the QAF, and maybe the QAF principles could be adapted for the assessment of other new assessment methodologies too. And with this, I have concluded this, same as Olga. Thank you very much to the colleagues from ISS and to the OECD Secretariat and every QAF group member. I believe this proverb really fits our work. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. It took us 2 years. Every time we were circulating a document, we received hundreds of comments, but this really gave us the opportunity to clarify details and to create a robust document. Here I have a non-exhaustive list, official list from OECD of all the experts that have contributed to the project, and I would like to thank all of them very much. We learned a lot, and everyone was useful with these comments and reviews. And finally, one slide of advertisement on the QSAR Toolbox video tutorials that we have just made available on ECHA's YouTube channel. We have 16 of them. We will prepare many more tutorials also next year. So if you go there and take a look, give us our feedback of what would you like to see covered next, because we will prepare more tutorials. And with this, I am very happy to answer any question that you may have asked.
Thank you very much, Dr. GC, and I'll invite Dr. Chermeskaya to come back as well. Great, thank you. Thank you to all who have added questions to the Q&A. We have quite a bit to cover here. Just a few general comments. There have been several questions in both the Q&A and the chat on where to find information. Andrea just mentioned the tutorials that are on ECHA's website. Those are also linked to the chat. I'll point out that there are a number of other links in the chat as well that include things like where to find the documents that were mentioned, how to access the chemical safety newsletter from OECD that will give you alerts on the new things that are being released, including the examples of how to use the QAF in real world situations, and the OECD YouTube channel, as well as the ECHA YouTube channel that was just mentioned. So we've got 37 questions. We'll see how we do, but I'll try to group them as well as I can. I'll start with just kind of a general question on how the QAF can be used. We had a question on whether or not the QAF could be used on UVCBs, and a similar question when assessing a substance containing multiple constituents. Also, using multiple predictive models, how would you suggest submission of a QPRF document to cover this? For example, one per constituent or multiple constituents within each QPRF. So those are both different questions, both on multi-constituent substances.
I can start and maybe Olga can complement. UVCBs and multi-constituent substances are about 50% of the substances, for example, registered under REACH, so they are very common. They can be covered by the using the QAF. We see that one principle is dedicated to the correctness of the input, so this can be for sure be done with the QAF. If you have multiple constituents predicted with multiple models, unfortunately, this is the reality. And in theory, the best will be to have one QPRF per prediction per model, but this sometimes leads to the generation of an unreasonable number of documents. So maybe what was suggested in the question to group the results per constituent, that should already make the work a little bit easier. I think in the end, of course, it depends on who you are preparing the information for, but for ECHA, as long as we can follow what has been done and we can be convinced that the prediction is reliable, that's good, whatever means you decide, or whatever way you decide to report the results. Unfortunately, we don't have a reporting format for results of multiple predictions, and this was mentioned in the future work. We realized this is missing, and maybe one day, hopefully not in the too far future, we will be able to provide one single template also to cover this type of cases.
Great, thank you very much for that. I will ask you this question, which is perhaps more theoretical, but the question is it now acceptable from a regulatory point of view to use some machine learning approaches or neural networks that can be described in detail, but do not provide a reproducible algorithm? And perhaps a related question that you might consider, which is related to artificial intelligence, and that is, while I look for it, that was, how do you foresee AI being used in this process? So a bit higher level and theoretical.
And they are all very interesting questions. Thank you for posting them. And I think it's since the QA framework is predicted endpoint and algorithm, it's unspecific and it's independent on the modeling technique and so on. It in theory it can be used, and it's necessary always to provide as much information as you can, so maybe to convince the regulators, but it's still in the developing area, of course. And I would like to point your attention, for example, to the recent some work within the European Partnership Park, where there are several tasks, and one of them is focused on the artificial intelligence QSAR models and how to use them in regulatory environment. And I think in a few years, maybe in 1 year, 2 years, we will have more information on how to report and how to use AI, ML models in regulatory environments. But still, I would like to say that it's possible to use them, just providing all the information which is available. And also it depends strongly on the regulatory framework.
Yes, maybe what I can add is that in the end, what we need as regulators is to be convinced that the prediction is reliable. And to be convinced, we have to check the documentation. One, I think, very good example of how problem of some neural networks being seen as black boxes, what the Vega software does. Some of the models in Vega, they are neural networks, maybe with very complex algorithms, difficult to describe, but still in the QPRF, it's very clear what is the prediction, how the model performs for similar substances, how similar are the substances, is the substance in domain. And, this type of information may shed light on the reliability of the prediction, even when the model is difficult to describe or reproduce.
Great, thank you. We had a number of questions regarding kind of who does what with regard to the QAF. So one of the questions was, will applicants be obliged to submit the QAF to authorities, or can it be submitted on a voluntary basis? And we had a number of other related questions with regard to the QAF potentially being aimed at regulators, and if you too thought it would be advantageous for model developers or submitters to use it pre-submission.
Yes, I think the QAF starts as a document that the regulators will use to evaluate QSAR predictions. Now, anyone else, before submitting the prediction, I think will benefit to try himself to self-assess its results according to the QAF, to understand what can happen if the prediction model is submitted to the regulatory authority. Hopefully, each regulatory authority will clarify how we'll use the QAF and what are the expectations from the applicants, registrants, and so on. Surely in ECHA, we will work in this direction, but this will happen only next year. What we already know in ECHA is that for now, nothing is changing because the QAF already follows what we do, and the REACH is in agreement with the official guidance that ECHA follows to assess user results. So we have no expectations for registrants to use the QAF or submit the QAF, but this will help us to assess QSARs and to be maybe even clearer on why we think there are problems when we identify problems with the result, etc. Other authorities may decide otherwise, but in ECHA, that's what we will do.
Yes, and also the both checklists are providing the mapping to QMRF and QPRF reporting format, so it can be easily identified if all available necessary information for the regulators is available in the model and prediction documentation. And so, as I said in my presentation, the comparing of the CAF assessment elements for models with QMRF would also be helpful for the model developers for the future models, and in order to understand which points should be considered by them in order to for the model documentation, in order to facilitate for the regulatory assessment and acceptance of the models. So yes, I think the mapping column is also very important.
Yeah, thank you for those answers. There was a question related to whether or not the assessment of the models will be shared with model developers, and I think Dr. Gysi, you made some allusion to that. So it's up to the specific regulatory authorities to make that decision, but certainly the point was made that that would be quite helpful. Okay, so questions that are related to accessibility to information. Certainly there are a number of these. The first of these is it necessary that separate data sets have been used for training and validation of the model? And then there are several questions around some potential obstacles related to commercially available models in that case. So maybe you both can address that first one, and then we'll move to the other ones.
Yeah, I think according to the CAF, also the CAF guidance, the training set and the sets used for external validation, they both should be independent. Otherwise, we are not getting the reliable result for model performance assessment.
Thank you.
Yes, I think why we need a validation set is to check whether the model has been overtrained and overfitted on the training set, we want to make sure it's also able to predict the new molecules. As always, there might be exceptions to what is needed, what is required, and about the technique used. For example, when you use the QSAR toolbox, you define your own category and your own trend based on similar mode of action, etc. In the end, you may have a trend, 4 or 5 points, and you are saying that my substance fits this trend and I trust this prediction. This might be a case where some authorities, under certain purposes, are not going to require a separate validation set. Test set in toolbox for sure is not available, but because the philosophy of what is being done and is different. So as always, there are exceptions, but in most of the cases, a validation set will be needed to make sure that we are not looking at a model that is overfitted on the training data.
Great, thank you. There's a question regarding applicability domain. The question asked, the applicability domain is strongly dependent on the used molecular fingerprints and similarity matrix. How do you expect this to be handled since one option does not necessarily fit all chemical domains? And the same database might result in different model characteristics dependent on the choice of similarity matrix and fingerprints, which might be swapped out for different chemicals to be assessed.
Okay, I can tell that my dog didn't like the question, started barking and ran away. But before we go there, patients, there were these, I think, important questions on commercial models, transparency. We kind of forgot to answer that. So maybe we say a few words on that and then we move to this this longer question. What do you think? Is that okay?
Sure. There was a question regarding protected data available in commercial models. And then there was also a sort of a related question on with regard to the use of common QSAR models like the EpiSuite tools for reach purposes. Are these models considered to be suitable? And if so, does one have to provide formal documentation that the models are usable? And then it noted that a list of QSAR models regarded to be suitable would be very helpful.
Okay, yes, several aspects here. Let's start from commercial models. And I, of course, what I'm answering based on ECHA experience, other authorities may do things differently. In general, we may accept predictions from commercial models, even when not all information for obvious business reasons, they are not shared. Still, once again, what we need to be able to assess is that the prediction is valid, reliable enough, etc. If a company cannot share the training set, a solution is to at least show the most similar substances to the one that is predicted, to show that the target substance is really within the domain. If we cannot see the full algorithm, at least to describe how descriptors contribute to the prediction and so on. So we must be in the position to accept prediction from commercial models, and we have found this compromise of getting at least the information, the contextual information to the prediction to make this assessment. On the other opposite of the spectrum, we have the models that have been around since forever, like EpiSuite, ECHA, publicly available to everyone. And there, maybe to a surprise for someone, the answer is that majority of these models are in general okay. We are still going to assess each individual predictions, but some of them, I can already tell, they are not good enough, at least for ECHA. And this, for example, would be the case for ECHA models predicting aquatic toxicity, models that are based on less than 5 substances. In ECHA, you have many classes of chemicals that can be predicted, and a good number of them has decent training sets with good statistics and so on. There are some classes where the training set is 1 substance, 2 substances, even 0 substances. We do not accept predictions from these models because for us there is no model in this case. We have also thought about a list of acceptable models. I don't know if it will ever come. Certainly, with the publication of the QSAR assessment framework, we would have at least a checklist to fill in and show to people. But still, we don't want people to misunderstand that an acceptable model will automatically mean that the prediction will be accepted, because the prediction will have to fulfill its own validity criteria. I don't know if Olga wanted to add anything else.
The assessment is always framework specific and depends on the regulators if to accept and to consider a model valid for their specific regulatory purpose or not. Yes, in this case, of course, for many commercial model, you will not find a description of algorithm this is fully disclosed, but the advantage of the CAF is that it's not prescriptive at all, because yes, there are a list of assessment elements, but even if not all assessment elements are fulfilled, it's still the model and relative prediction still can be accepted by regulators, such in case, for example, in artificial intelligence machine learning models or commercial models with not fully disclosed algorithm and so on. It's always up to the regulators, and always the more information, the best solution here to provide all available information. The more information is provided also by the model documentation and prediction report, it's more chance that the prediction can be accepted by a regulatory agency.
Yeah, thank you for that. There was a question regarding if it was foreseen that OECD would validate QSAR models, and I think you've both addressed that. Really, the concern is it's up to the regulators to accept models for specific purposes. So there are examples where OECD validates the use of QSARs in particular contexts. For example, the inclusion in the defined approach for skin sensitization that's part of a test guideline. But I think what you see here is that the work to develop guidance so regulators can assess that for their own specific purposes in their own contexts. Okay, so here's a bit of a change in direction. Do you consider models
sorry, before we change, there was the difficult or question, at least the long question. So otherwise it looks like we try to get away. I finally managed to find it in the Q&A, so I think now I read it, I understand it, and I can provide an answer before we move forward.
Sure, please do.
And so what we will do with the QSAR assessment framework is that we assess the applicability domain as defined by the model developer. Yeah. So the model developer will choose the fingerprints that think are best, the technique in general that is best for the applicability domain, and we check that those conditions are fulfilled for the target substance. So we check that the target substance fits whatever condition has been decided to be the best by the model developer. Then in the reliability assessment, we are going to check other aspects that we believe are important. And I think when it comes to physicochemical ranges and etc., we are going to be pragmatic and keep it simple. It's true that depending on the similarity technique or measures that you use, you may have different similar structures, etc. But what we want to see is that there are structures that from toxicological point of view make sense, they are similar to the target, and they are predicted consistently by the model. And this goes beyond the statistical technique that is used to find those analytes. We want to look at them and be able to decide. And if there are different ways to measure or find those, okay. In the end, we will use expert judgment and toxicological considerations that go beyond the pure mathematical function used to identify analytes.
Yes, and also as it's written in the guidance, to facilitate the assessment, developers of new models are encouraged, strongly encouraged to implement automatic functionalities to access applicability domain, in this case, don't have any doubts how it should be accessed according to the model developers and according to the model documentation. So Yes, but it's very interesting questions. Thank you.
Well, I have to say we have a number of unanswered questions that will probably have to remain unanswered since we're almost at the end of time. I'll note that a number of the questions regard, for example, different regulatory agencies' requirements for using different types of in silico predictions and what the rule is for the QSAR assessment framework or the QSAR toolbox. I'll just remind everyone that this was really intended in the OECD context to be very flexible and up to the particular regulatory authorities to decide, but the guidance was particularly geared to help regulators assess the scientific validity and robustness of not only the models, but the predictions and results of multiple predictions. So it's, as Olga just mentioned, intentionally flexible. I'll ask if we still have a number of questions which we'll try to answer in writing and perhaps group appropriately and then share with the attendants of this meeting, but I do note that we're at time. So I'll ask if there are any last words from our presenters today.
I'm scrolling through the questions to see if there is like some inspiration for final words, but maybe, you know, there are so many unanswered questions that it will be easier to then provide the written answer to them. So if we want to have some closing remarks, I thank everyone for joining this webinar. I hope you start consulting the QAF, using it for your own purposes, and send us feedback on like the parts that you appreciate, on the parts that you think are not clear, can be improved, because we will keep working in this space, and we will take any feedback into account when doing further work. Thank you.
And I also would like to thank all of you for joining. And yes, any feedback will be greatly appreciated, because there might be next steps and next development in the field of the CAF. And so, yes, and thank you for listening. And it was a great pleasure to be here today.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank both Dr. Gysi and Chair Miskaya for their great presentations and answers today, and for all of the interest. We have over 50 questions, so that clearly indicates that there's a lot of enthusiasm about this product. And so, as mentioned, the slides will be publicly available. The presentations will be posted on the OECD website, and we'll make an attempt to answer many of these questions in writing. So thank you all for your attention today, and I wish you a great rest of the day, and thanks again to the presenters. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.